All right, welcome everyone. I'm so grateful to have you back in this next edition of the COVID-19 Survey Working Group. Very appreciative to everyone who has joined us in real time here on the Zoom call, as well as viewers participating via YouTube. My name is Eric Kennedy. I'm an assistant professor of disaster and emergency management at York University in Toronto, Canada. I'm working on some COVID-19 survey research, but also excited to be convening this group of researchers from literally around the world. I know on this call we have both the United Kingdom and New Zealand represented, as well as everyone in between. And so thank you to everyone who is joining in at odd hours around the world. I am so excited this week to have Dr. Alex Freeman and a crew of really excellent experts from the Winton Center who are going to be discussing a variety of approaches to transnational research in COVID. Last week, we dove into an example of one nation of research, looking at how Statistics Canada was mobilizing crowdsourcing and web panels to try to generate data much quicker than a traditional statistic agency might be thought of. In this case, we're going to look at the transnational context and see how one research group has been able to generate really interesting insights from a comparative project across a lot of countries. Now, the normal format of the agenda here is that we'll reserve the majority of time for our guest, Dr. Alexander Freeman, and for that presentation. But before we get started on that, I do want to give a brief opportunity to a couple of members of the working group to share very brief updates on their research and work that they're doing in the survey realm. And so if I could call on Simon Bacon first, then we'll have Cassidy Howell, and then we'll have Harriet Hartman share very brief updates first. So Simon Bacon.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for just giving me this moment. Kind of apropos. Our study, the iCare study, is a large international study. We have about almost 70,000 people now across 140 countries. And we've just released our Survey 5. So we've been doing this roughly every month to 6 weeks throughout the pandemic, starting in late March. So that's now just been pushed out. So I can provide details and submit stuff there if people want to circulate that. Whole heap of stuff that's been sort of found out from that. It's available 36 different languages. It's tied to cases, data from Johns Hopkins and from Oxford policy data, etc. So I just wanted to give you the update that that's the new version just came out yesterday.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Would be happy to share that link with the group. And let's talk further about that as well. Cassidy Howell, would you like to share next?
Yes, hi. My name is Cassidy Howell. I'm a senior associate at the Save and Vaccine Institute. And we're excited that we just released our new survey last week. And it's more of really like an opinion poll, a pulse. Basically, we are interested in reaching out to researchers, organizational or thought leaders, funders, investors, policymakers, a whole host of communities that are currently responding to COVID-19. And our question is, how will COVID-19 shape the pandemic vaccine R&D ecosystem? So we're really interested in learning how we can sustain this momentum that has been behind COVID vaccine, accelerated vaccine development, the collaborations, the funding, all of the things that are making this really unprecedented effort happen, and how can we sustain these efforts towards preventing pandemics in the future. So one of our big areas of interest is accelerating the development of a universal influenza vaccine, but there are plenty of other kind of pandemic vaccines we're interested in learning lessons from COVID for. So yeah, we are excited we'll share that link for folks. And that's what we're working on now. The survey will be anonymous and the results will be shared in partnership with Nature Research, probably in a month or so, depending on, respondent rates.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Much appreciated. Again, we're happy to circulate that link with the group as well, and so glad to have you in this community for today's session and on an ongoing basis. And then finally, I'd like to invite Harriet Hartman to speak about a Converge group. I think this is really apropos because this working group is supported by the Converge program out of the NSF and University of Colorado Boulder. And so we would love to hear about this working group on first-generation college students.
Thank you. I'm Harriet Hartman. I'm at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. And I'm part of 6 colleges across the nation that are focusing on first generation college students. We just launched the first fall survey. We're going to do a fall and a spring survey, and we have 2 surveys going out. One is a regular kind of survey looking at it. We're focusing on the challenges to persistence for first generation college students because of COVID. And we have our regular survey going out, but we also have a photo voice survey where they're supposed to take a picture and explain their working space and what does this mean, and it'll be really exciting. I think we did some piloting in the summer and it looks really good. So if you're interested, please email me and I will get you more information. I'll put my email up on the chat.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And one of the things that I'm excited to do over the coming sessions that we have into the next months and beyond is highlight some unique survey research methods as well. We're going to have a presenter in the future on diary studies, looking at how that's being applied to COVID. We've got a number of folks looking at mental health angles and how those can be measured reliably. And so photo voice is another really interesting angle to pursue some of these questions. And so thank you for sharing that. And thanks to everyone who shared today. At every meeting, I will invite, just before we start, anyone who wants to speak to identify themselves in the chat. And so if in future meetings you'd like to give a brief update, feel free to drop by just a couple of minutes early and let me know you'd be interested, and we'll give you the time to share your project. But for the moment, it is now my absolute great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexandra Freeman from the Winton Center. They have been doing just phenomenal and inspiring work in this transnational context, and I'm so excited to learn a little bit more from her and her team. So I will pass the floor to you and just invite everyone to hold on to your questions, because we will have ample time for discussing them as we go. I think Alex will present for no more than about 15 or 20 minutes here, and then we'll open this up to conversation and questions from the group to explore further. So thank you so much to Alex, and take it away.
Pleasure. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Yes, so we at the Winton Centre in Cambridge in the UK are a group of about 15 of us now, and we specialise in studying how to communicate risk, and particularly communicating uncertainty, communicating medical evidence, and communicating evidence to policymakers. Those are 3 of our big areas of interest. And so, as you can imagine, once there was a policy relevant, uncertain medical emergency coming towards the world, suddenly we became a little bit busy. And we've been working on COVID related stuff pretty much from March, and a lot of our other work has had to go on hold. But we've been delighted to be able to help people who are trying to communicate COVID. And the sorts of things that we normally do, we're a very interdisciplinary group. My background was as a documentary maker. We have several professional communicators on the team. We've got software engineers. We make tools for communicating medical evidence. And we've got psychologists. And 3 of my psychology colleagues are on this call today because they can talk much more about the methods that we've been using, especially in the analysis of data. But I'm going to give a sort of very brief overview and then leave it up to you to talk about the things and ask questions about the things that you're most interested in. So the sorts of questions that really came to mind in March when all of this started kicking off for us are the things that we were normally interested in. So we've been working on how to communicate uncertainty ranges around numbers, looking at graphical communication, verbal, numerical communication, and how that affects people's trust. We were also very interested to see that the WHO were immediately communicating advice with a sentence that said why, and they were trying to give the evidence behind advice. And so we wanted to test what adding that evidence did to people's intents to follow the advice and their trust in that advice. We have a project running longer term on the communication of quality of evidence, so that was part of our interests. So we immediately wanted to run some controlled, randomized experiments in these areas that we were already interested in. But on top of that, there's a whole area of risk communication which looks at the perception of risk, how people's levels of worry and anxiety are affected by their trust, say, in those in charge, and how it's affected by various demographic features. There's something called the white male effect, where people who are ethnically white, this research was done in the US, and males have a different perception of risk from others in the community. So we were interested in that kind of thing. And also, because of my media background, I'm very interested in media exposure and how that affects people's perception of risk and their reactions to advice that they might be getting. And we've got an overall interest again in numeracy, because we find that people's numeracy affects a lot how they respond to numeric information, as you might expect. So in about sort of early to mid-March, second week of March, we really realized that this opportunity was coming quite quickly. And within 10 days, we put together a questionnaire that we hoped to be able to run initially in the UK and the US. And that's then really snowballed for us. So these are the surveys that we've run. And as I said, it took us about 10 days to get our first survey out in the UK and US on the 19th of March. And then all the rest kind of followed very quickly from there. So Australia was obviously fairly easy for us to run because it didn't require translation. And then we were incredibly lucky that within the team, we had native speakers of German, Italian, Spanish, and Korean. So we were able to get translations done very quickly of the questionnaire into those languages. I was very keen to run the survey in China, so we paid for professional translation into Chinese for the mainland, traditional Chinese for the mainland. And then we had some previous collaborators in Japan who were very happy to translate it and help us run it in Japan. And we were then contacted when we started talking about our research on Twitter and on social media and by publishing blogs. We were contacted by researchers in France and Sweden who were very keen to run the survey, and so they translated it, and the French researchers actually ran the survey themselves. In Sweden we ran it, and then the Irish government got in touch and they wanted to run the survey in Ireland as well. So that's how we ended up with all of these different countries. And as you can see, some of them we've run multiple times because we were keen to do some, I say longitudinal, but it was a different sample of the population each time. So that's sort of following the pandemic in different countries. And the main things that helped us get to run these things so quickly, first of all, was that our ethics committee were fantastic. And usually it takes, 6 weeks to get something through ethics, but in this circumstance, they did it in 48 hours for us, which was great. And our funding model is really unusual because we run we were given a 5-year grant by a philanthropist. So we can run whatever we like within our own budgets. And I had a little emergency fund put aside for this kind of thing. So we've been able to use that, which allowed us to run this survey without having to apply for funding. And we got our ethics through quickly. And then again, as I say, translation, we were very lucky. And thanks to those on the call who did some of that translation. So moving on then, we used different platforms to get our population samples. So because we were running randomized controlled trials, we really wanted to have as representative a sample as we could. Now, our sampling, as you can see, is quite quick and dirty in that we were getting out into the field very quickly. And our expertise is not in doing kind of balanced opinion surveys. So what we did was we worked with various different participant recruitment platforms, online participant recruitment platforms that could help us reach these different countries. So Prolific is a company that does online psychology experiments, and we've used them quite a lot before, and they've got a good UK and US population. So they were our first port of call. But Respondi was a company that we had just started working with who have a very good European population. So we used them for a lot of the European work, and then we found actually we liked their UK sample very much. So, and I'll come back to why. And they used their partners to help us run the samples in Korea, Japan, and China. And so they helped work with local recruitment platforms to work in those countries. In Australia, we used Dynata, which was a platform that John, who's on this call and is from New Zealand, helped us find and had worked with before. And in France, we didn't collect the data. They used a local sampling company called BVA. And I mentioned the difference between different platforms, and one of the really big differences that we noticed was in the objective numeracy tasks that we set people. This for us, as I said, was a key demographic piece of information, and we found it's really correlates very strongly with a lot of the things we're interested in. And we found that Prolific, as you can see there in the dark blue on the graph, have a much higher level of numeracy in their sampled population than Respondi do in the green. So even though it's a UK sample and it's the same balance of gender and age, so we set quotas or we use the sampling quotas from the companies to make it representative of the population on age and gender. And we also collect demographic information on all sorts of other things like employment status, ethnicity, where we can ask that question, social status, perceived social status, education levels, all of these things. And really the numeracy is the key thing that we've noticed really different between different platforms. Education also sometimes changes, but it's just a really important thing for us to make sure that we know our populations and how much they can differ between platforms in the same country. And we can talk more about why these things might differ in the questions if you're interested. So the sorts of things we did then were, we were able to very quickly make graphs like this across different countries for all sorts of the questions that we asked. So as well as running our controlled experiments, we combined those with a lot of questions that either we just thought were interesting or were going to help us potentially find covariates of some of the things that we were measuring, or that we thought might be newsworthy, because we work in a way that, because some of us are professional communicators, we like to be able to feed stories into the press, as well as feeding stories into our colleagues in government, as well as doing research that, you know, might be beneficial for others, since we're putting the effort into doing the survey. So one of the questions, for instance, we'd asked, because of the pandemic, how much have you experienced financial difficulties, social difficulties, mental health difficulties? And this was back in March, we were setting these questions. So we were trying to kind of guess what sorts of things people would want to know. And as you can see, on a scale of 7, we draw these lovely graphs, and thanks to John, who's on the call for these. And we were able to produce these sorts of reports for various governments who had asked us for details once they knew we were doing this research. This is another similar graph looking at their feelings about different aspects of the pandemic. So how do you feel your actions and your country's actions are affecting it? And you can see from these graphs, note the absence on this one of China, because when we worked in Asia, there are differences in culture, and in China specifically, we had censorship that we had to go through before we could put the questions out there. So there are quite a lot of cultural differences. For instance, talking about deaths is somewhat taboo in some countries. In some countries, you can't ask about ethnicity. And in China, we couldn't ask any questions about officials or government responses. So the local partners of our recruitment platforms helped us with the censorship and with testing the cultural sensitivity of our questions. And we were able to work quite well with them. They were very forgiving of our misunderstandings and, you know, understood that we didn't know what we were and weren't allowed to ask. So they were very helpful. It added probably about 5 to 7 days onto the translation time to get these into a state where they could be released. We asked all sorts of things, as I said, about their reactions and their exposure to different sources of information. And these were really helpful for us when we started looking at correlations. And so we've been looking at this kind of thing, what factors correlate with trust in different sources of information, and looking at how trust in particular groups, so up in the top left, trust in experts, correlates with your trust in a governmental source of information or official source of information about COVID. And all sorts of other, you know, gender, numeracy, all these effects. So, you know, these are the sorts of things that we've been looking at. And also with our actual experiments, so we were interested in people's beliefs in misinformation when we gave them statements that were or weren't misinformation, how well could they spot it? And we can look at different factors that correlate with that in different countries, and that's been very interesting to look at. Not a lot of work has been done, for instance, on misinformation beliefs in countries other than the US and the UK. And we also formed a risk perception index out of several questions, 3 of which came from you, Eric. So thank you for that, about the likelihood and severity. But risk perception isn't just about the numeric sort of, you know, the cognitive elements of weighing up likelihood and severity. There's worry as well. So we created an index which had a sort of holistic risk perception from 6 questions, and then looked at that in different countries. And so we could look at the factors that affect risk perception all around the world. And we're also looking at the stability of that over time as we resample some of these countries. And finally, then, some of our dissemination. So because we've got communicators, professional communicators within the team with different native languages, we've been able to write articles that have been covered in Mexico and Spain and the UK. And I was surprised when making the slide to find that our report for the Irish government went straight on their website as well. So we've had quite a lot of coverage in papers, which has been great. And also that's been a nice 2-way communication, because we get to hear what people are interested in, and we can put that in future surveys as we run them. So we have today been working on our 5th survey for the UK, which we're hoping to run maybe tomorrow if ethics comes through. So I will finish there, and this is a kind of slide of things that we can talk about. As I say, there are other members of the team on this call, so we're very happy to talk about some of our results if you're interested, more about the practicalities if you're interested, more about the differences between the different platforms, analysis techniques, and maybe about some of the sort of cross-sectional data. As I say, it's not with the same panel of people, it's with different panels of people, but in the UK, as I say, we've done 5 of those. And we've also done another body of work with another 4 surveys specifically in the UK on how to communicate risk. So I will stop there and hand over for questions.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fantastic. And there's so much for us to dig into here. And so I would encourage as much as possible, if you can put questions into the chat, that's the easiest way for us to aggregate them and make sure we can address them in buckets of themes. And so please do feel free to throw in your questions there. If you're watching live on YouTube, you can put them in the chat there as well. We'll monitor there. And so you have a way of getting involved too. There are a couple of questions that have come up already about the risk perception side of things. And so let's start off there. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the development of the risk perception index, and then we'll dive into some deeper parts of that. So how did you decide what goes into that? How did you build up that index, and how did it work?
I'm going to hand over for that to either Sarah or Claudia. Which of you wants to talk about that?
I suppose we can back and forth between Claudia and I and John. Maybe that would make it more interesting as well. I'm happy to start. So I think so we wanted to tap into this idea that, well, as Alex touched on, risk perception isn't just to do with the cognitive domain, like having an assessment of how likely you are to be infected or whatnot, but there are also other facets that are important as well. So affect, emotions, how worried people are, but also sort of sociocultural factors as well. And Claudia might be able to speak a bit more about this than I can, because she's done work on this in the climate change domain. But I know one of our collaborators that she works with closely, Sander, he developed a risk perception measure that tried to integrate these different facets of risk perception so into a more holistic measure. So that was our thinking, was kind of based on some of his research there. So that was what we did there. Yeah, and I mean, we can talk a little bit about how we actually sort of created it logistically, if you want. I don't know whether that's
sure. Yes, absolutely.
And would anyone else like to? I feel like I'm talking too much. I don't know if anybody else would like to step in.
I can chime in. So, after we had all of our questions in the different domains, given that we had quite a few countries, we looked at the distributions of the different sub-items across the different countries, checked how well they were correlated, defined, sort of like acceptable levels and not acceptable levels for intercorrelations. Then some of the items were on different scales. Some were 5-point scales, the other ones were 7-point scales. So we put them onto the same scale and then averaged them to create the index. Looked at Crumbus alpha, those kinds of things. Not sure how much detail we should go into. If that's helpful.
Oh, that's very welcome, and don't be afraid with this group of nerding out a little bit on the methods side. To push this a little bit further, Harriet had asked about the way that these indices work across different countries. Can you tell us a little bit about how you thought about that transnational context in the development of indices, and anything you learned along the way comparing how they functioned and how you used them across multiple national contexts?
Maybe I can start out. So, I mean, in terms of the sort of the components, in terms of the concepts and the theories for the risk perception index, we did not think sort of that, cross-nationally at that stage. It was really more driven, as Sarah said, by the kind of work in the risk perception literature, the work that Sander had been doing, combining the sort of cognitive and emotional elements. So at that stage, it was less about thinking, like, is one country, for whatever reason, more on the emotional side, the other one's more on the cognitive side. If that is even, a country level thing, it might also be like more personal. So like really how this came about was that once we had sort of theoretically formed the idea for this risk perception measure, not thinking about the different cultures, then once we had collected them, this is then when we went into the sort of, you know, checking and like analysis stage and just looked, you know, how well did these hang together in the different countries? Because obviously, you know, we wouldn't have just combined them in a country where they were absolutely not correlated and maybe, you know, people understood them differently or sorts of similar problems. But we found that for the 6 sub-items that we used for the final measure, it really was, you know, like well correlated in all of the different countries, which was nice because that really allowed us to have the one same measure and then run our different regression models with the predictors across the different countries to have, you know, some kind of descriptive comparability between the different country surveys.
Yeah, if I jump in there as well. Someone mentioned invariance testing, which we haven't done at this stage, but is certainly a possibility. And one other thing that came up was that we were still, at the time we were writing the paper, still undertaking surveys. So there were sort of last minute additions there as well, but we were checking the reliability across all of them. But we haven't gone as far as invariance testing, which yeah, as I think Alex shared a link saying the data is available as well. So there's something that we can check it in the future.
Thank you, both of you. I'm curious if we can turn to Simon's angle on this. I don't know, Simon, if you would like to speak a little bit more to what you're getting at here, but in the chat you had asked about the modeling of risk perception, whether actual risk was taken into account. Do you want to further that question a little bit for the group?
Yeah, I guess, well, you know, risk perception, you can have, you can perceive your risks to be very high, and that could be very accurate, right? And if you've got strong risk perception and a strong threat scenario, that's totally appropriate. Where you start normally having issues and you know, problems is where you start having the disconnect between either a high risk perception and actual low real risk, or vice versa, low risk perception and higher potential, which is probably what we're seeing a lot more of, especially within younger individuals with regards to COVID. So I was just curious to know if you'd explored any of those aspects and how you dealt with those issues within the context of the survey.
Thanks, Simon.
So I was just going to say, so it's a great point, and that was one of the weaknesses that we identified when we were at least initially writing this up for the first paper. So we were very much focused on perception, but you make a great point that it's often the mismatch between perception and the reality of the risk that can lead to issues. So we and many other people have sort of linked risk perception to health protective behaviours, health preventative behaviours. Of course, if people's risk perception is lower than it should be, then they might not engage in those behaviours so much. Equally, there's evidence to suggest that, you know, if risk perception is very high, it can affect people's mental health. There have been some COVID studies that have linked depression with levels of worry. So one axis of that risk perception. I think the difficulty for us, and it's something that's definitely worth exploring, is knowing what is the right level of risk to perceive, and that's, I don't know how objectively that can be measured, because obviously it depends on many other factors, not least the sort of political climate in a country and that kind of thing. But it's something I think Alex thinks about a lot as well. We sort of speak about how do we know what's the right level of risk to perceive, and it's a great point, and it's something that we're thinking about. I don't know if anyone else has further thoughts or comments on that.
Oh, I'd like to jump in on that, because it's everything we do in the centre is about communicating risk, and it's impossible for us to know whether we're communicating something well or not, because there is no right answer to what somebody should personally perceive their risk as. It's not really to do with the absolute risks in your area, because for instance, if someone was building a nuclear power station down the road from me, my perception of the risk would be quite low if I really trusted their competence in running it, but it would be really high if it was being run by a cowboy firm that I really didn't trust at all. So my levels of trust in the managers of that risk has a profound impact on my perception of the risk, and that is totally justifiable. So I think it's, I think trying to say that people's subjective risk perception should match an objective, measurable fact, as it were, is, although there are some things that you might say, you know, there's a real mismatch here, I think it's very difficult to get down into the nitty-gritty because it's such a personal thing, perception. It's a subjective measure.
Absolutely. I'm curious to follow that thread just a minute longer here and ask, are there ways that this survey work has changed how you think either methodologically or theoretically about risk? Are there things that worked well or did not work so well in how your measures were applied, or in the kinds of things that you found? Any way that has changed your approach to this through the COVID research?
Well, certainly in terms of the things that we're digging more and more into now, because we keep, you know, tweaking the survey and adding things that we find are interesting. I'm personally really interested in issues of trust and digging into what trust decomposes into. The sort of 3 theoretical aspects of trust that have been written about a lot in the literature are people's assessments of competence, of caring, whether somebody has your best motivation, has your best interests at heart, and their honesty and reliability. So trying to decompose why people trust some information and some sources of information more than others, I think is really interesting, because one thing that we found, which was a little bit of a surprise, was when we give people particular messages about, you know, health behavior or advice, we find that the thing that really seems to predict their intention to take that advice is not their level of understanding, but their level of trust in that piece of information and their assessment of the quality of the evidence around that advice and that information. So that's been something that has kind of intrigued me, and that we're definitely digging into more and more and refining the wording of our questions to really get at these issues with people. So I would say personally, that's something that I've learned and am continuing to learn quite a lot about.
Thank you. So as you were answering there, it sort of hinted at experimental setups around messaging and testing these out. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've used experimentation in your methodological design and in your approach to surveying here?
I'm going to hand over to Claudia because she spent all day doing experimental design.
What sorts of elements are you interested in? More the methodological setup, or why we chose the topics we chose, or just that I'm not going into a direction that's not interesting?
No, both would be wonderful. Perhaps you can start sort of giving us a sense as a group of where you embedded experimental designs into this research. And then you can talk about how you sort of prioritize those and then how you set them up.
Yeah. So, I mean, as Alex said, when we started doing these COVID surveys, you know, we were already working on different projects relating to the quality of the evidence, for instance, or, you know, the communication of, you know, direct uncertainty, sort of confidence intervals, how to do that visually. And so we tried to embed them, sort of these themes, in our surveys in a COVID context. So for my project, for instance, I work on the quality of evidence side of things. So, you know, we had sort of the survey questions that we talked about, you know, the risk perception measures. And then we mostly did this then, like at the end, we had our experimental survey part in the Qualtrics survey, where then we would, you know, give them like a little text snippet, for instance, something about, you know, one was about the case fatality rate of COVID-19, and then had our different divvies following that. For the project that Alex mentioned, looking at WHO advice and the sort of, you know, why should we socially distance, or why should we quarantine ourselves for 7 days? You know, looking at what parts of that wording, what parts of that message, you know, is linked in what way to their perception of the quality of the evidence, their perception or like how much they trust it, and you know, whether they're indicating that they would follow this behavioral advice or not. So yeah, it was a mixture of, you know, having our sort of survey items. Some of them function as like priors and covariates or exploratory moderators for our experimental parts. And then usually at the end of the survey, before the demographics, we would have our different experimental sections. Yeah.
Thank you. That's fantastic. In terms of your experience with working with these experimental elements, which of them worked well? What experiments really stood out as being interesting and useful? And were there ones where you had lessons learned and either things you wouldn't do again or things you would change going forward?
Yeah, okay, quick answer, and then someone else can say something too. So I think, I mean, like all of them were super interesting. And I think because, you know, as Alex said, like our research is not so much about, you know, we want people to do X and then we're testing whether they do that, but more about, you know, just like decomposing how do people understand these different things? What do they do with the different kinds of information that we give them? So this is why, in that sense, all of our experiments worked, right? Like they all gave us interesting insights. Your second part of the question about something that was interesting.
Lessons learned and what was interesting along the way.
I think one point that in my work that stood out was, you know, the sort of fine line or some of the issues that can arise when you're dealing sort of, you know, on the theoretical setting up an experimental design, you know, with like very sort of controlled wording, but then you also want to have the real world relevance. So for instance, in the project where we used the WHO advice, they obviously didn't come up with this advice from an experimental standpoint, right? So there's like many moving pieces. So we're like trying to like decompose, oh, is it that like, you know, they're having uncertainty in there versus more definitive? Is it because here they're using like language that's more about, you know, it's novel and not well known yet, versus in another of their advice pieces, it's more sort of like, you know, well known, more like common sense. So, you know, that then throws difficulties with regards to the experimentation to really pin it down. So this is why for some of the studies we're now launching the 4th round, because each round we like learn something and then we like, you know, had to dig deeper into it. So, you know, I mean, it's a lesson learned to the extent that, you know, like if you're trying to do and like both and kind of like try to walk this fine line that you're dealing with these sorts of things. But then, you know, although it might not be the cleanest just from like a theoretical experimental standpoint, it does give you really, really valuable insights, because these are the things that are being used out there in the world, you know, that people are confronted with. So we think it's really nice that this has the sort of practical relevance.
Thank you. So I want to pull at that thread, some of the real world constraints here and how things move during the time, because at least from my experience living through a March that felt like a year long, it felt like there were things changing all the time, and a question that felt good at 6 a.m. felt terrible by 6 p.m. And we had a lot of that variation. So I'm curious to hear sort of how you handled the evolution of this issue and how much was changing while you were trying to stabilize these surveys, both on the micro term of March and the chaos of that, but also how you've handled evolution since in your multiple rounds.
Well, because we were lucky enough, I mean, as I say, we're kind of quick and dirty with these, because our ethics committee will turn around now an amendment within a few hours. And because we have our own funding, we can do what we like. We've been able to, as things feel like they're changing, you get a sense certainly within the UK, it's easy for us to get a sense of public change. We get a sense of the kind of questions that might be interesting now or in a couple of weeks' time. We've been able to turn around, you know, a new UK study as we feel that things are changing, if the government's announced some new measures or whatever. So we did turn them around and kick them out quite quickly in the UK. It was very frustrating when we were having the translations done for some of the countries. So Japan, for instance, I kept hearing reports about how people were really, you know, things were changing so fast in Japan. And it's like, damn, have we not got it ready to run yet? So those ones I was sitting on the edge of my seat and just desperate. and also trying to get our participants in quickly enough, because you didn't want to spread out the collection of data over more than 24 hours, really. I mean, sometimes we were still getting some of the harder to reach demographics, which is usually the under 24-year-old men, but sometimes the over 65-year-old women. Those were the harder demographics, and those sometimes took a couple of days to come in, which was a bit frustrating in some cases. But yeah, generally, we were looking ahead to what was announced politically in different countries if we knew that there was going to be a change that was coming in, and we would try and get in the right sorts of questions. And sometimes we were lucky, you know, we had questions about face masks in from March, and so seeing the change in attitudes to face masks around the world evolve was good. And sometimes we made unlucky decisions, and then we didn't have data. We decided to leave out a question on vaccines, say, and then by the time the question has come back, everybody's talking about what's happened to vaccine, you know, feelings about vaccines, and we haven't asked the right question. So, you know, it's hit and miss. But then if we really need to know something, we just kick out another questionnaire if we really need to know. But we are swimming in data. I mean, I've put it all out there publicly on OSF, because there's so much more than we could ever deal with, and we want it to be useful for other people. So it's there. And so if anybody comes along and says, can you answer this? Quite often the answer is, yes, you can answer it yourself. Here's the data set.
A curse and a blessing simultaneously. One of the things I've struggled with as a researcher here is grappling with the tension between keeping things consistent and all of the things I want to change as I learn how it works throughout the process. How do you deal with that tension in your work and with these simultaneous goals of the longitudinal comparison, but also making the tweaks and modifications that you learn are so important along the way?
Yeah, there's no right answer to it, is there? I mean, yeah, we try to keep things consistent, basically. And I mean, that's one thing that we haven't really talked about is the length of our surveys. I mean, they're 20 to 25 minutes long. These are massive. Because we're asking so many different things, we're usually running at least 2, sometimes 3 randomized control studies in each one. And we like to keep consistency. So we have a few questions where we don't run them every time, and then we regret it. But a lot of the time we're just trying to keep it consistent because we want that longitudinal data, you know, longitudinal as in over time data, especially as the pandemics change in each country. And every time you think you've probably come to your final one, there's a second wave or something, and we end up doing another one. But yeah, it's a toss-up whether to change things, whether to keep them the same, and you just have to use your judgment and then curse yourself a week later.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that feeling firsthand. I'm curious to get a sense, earlier on you referred to linking up with government priorities and needs of the stakeholders. I'm curious what has worked and what hasn't in your approaches to that. How do you, how have you been able to feed in questions that are of relevance and get them translated into action? And have there been moments where there's been disconnect or challenge in doing that?
I don't know that anything's ever been changed into action. So because we do, you know, we fund all our own research and we're independent, we don't, we're not beholden to anyone, which is great. But we do want to be useful, and we have been contacted by people in different countries for our data, and people have asked specific questions which we can choose to slip into our surveys. So, you know, we have done when there's questions of, you know, around vaccines or about trust or about opinions on different things, we can slip them in. But as I said, we're not really a centre that specialises in opinions, and there are much better places that people can go to if they really want to know, you know, a real country population opinion on something. But what we have been able to do is look at things that might affect, say, risk perception, or how risk perception might affect vaccine uptake. You know, these kinds of questions are the sorts of things that we are possibly better placed than some others to help answer. And so when people come to us with questions like that, we just put together a little report and ping it off. And we usually don't hear much back except some thanks. So who knows whether they actually make it into any you know, decision-making process. I like to think they do. Some of the work that we've been doing in the UK is more directly focused at public communications. So we've been doing some research on how to communicate the personalized risk of dying from COVID. So if you catch it, what are your chances of dying from it? So that can be a front end to a tool. And there are a lot of algorithms out there now that we know the people who are developing algorithms, and they need to know how to communicate somebody's risk of dying. And so we've been doing a particular set of work on that, which has been a lot of randomized controlled trials, but also involving some observational questions about people's attitudes to that kind of information. And we combine that with qualitative work as well, because we've got some qualitative researchers within the team. So we've been doing interviews with people as well to kind of help us understand the sorts of questions that we should ask in the surveys.
Fantastic, thank you. So we are coming into the last few minutes that we have here as a community. So if you do have any last pressing questions, please feel free to throw those into the chat. There are a couple more that I want to pull out though, before we wrap up. So one is that I want to come back to this question of censorship on questions, because I think this is a really interesting dynamic of doing multinational research. So I'm curious if you can tell us a bit more about that. And perhaps some of the nuance of how those processes work, to what degree this was sort of explicitly mandated versus self-imposed. Can you walk us through a bit more of the censorship angle in developing your study?
Yes, nothing was self-imposed, it was all explicit. So you literally can't ask questions about people's opinion of the government and officials in China, and you can't ask about one of our questions was, how likely do you think you are to suffer from the following? Embedded within that was coronavirus, but we wanted to put that risk perception in context with other risks that people might perceive. And so we had corruption and fraud as one of our questions of whether you thought you were how likely you thought you were to suffer from that. And we weren't allowed to ask that question in China. So literally our questionnaire would go to our partners in the different countries, who would look at them, and then we would get comments back, some of which were advisory and some of which were a blanket no. And then we would discuss these. Some of them were fine. We were happy to just take them out. I mean, not happy, but we understood we had to take them out. Some things we discussed again with our ethics people back at Cambridge, where there were changes to things like the participant information. There were issues about giving out my contact details as the person to contact around the study, and changes to some of the legal wording around data protection that we're used to putting out within Europe, and which is also acceptable in North America. But there were issues with that in some of the Asian countries. And so we had discussions about that, which pinged backwards and forwards. And in the end, we came up with a solution that everyone was happy with. But yeah, so that's how it works. You have to work with partners, really, who help you through this.
Yeah, what a fascinating context. Okay, so we'll wrap up here with a couple of questions that have come in about respondents and biases. So one question was around the use of internet literacy and internet access and the like in your response pools. Can you tell us how you sort of chose the sampling strategy you did and how you identified and accounted for challenges in terms of participation bias there?
Yes, so we, as I say, we're kind of quick and dirty. So we realized that our respondent pool isn't representative on every aspect, and in fact, not on lots of aspects. And as I said, we recognized the differences when we collected the demographics between different countries. So quite often we were in a highly educated sample. We're always obviously in a sample that has access to the internet. So in different countries that creates different biases. So as I say, we try not to major too much on our kind of representativeness, and especially when that comes to opinions. When it comes to the randomized studies that we focus more on, it's slightly less of an issue, but as the numeracy differences between different platforms really highlighted, that can be a significant bias for some of the factors that affect responses to our controlled studies as well. So it is something that we have to recognize and is a limitation of our sampling strategy. But on the other hand, we were able to do this work quickly and affordably. So, you know, it swings and roundabouts. Not everything's going to be perfect. And I think we just have to put our hands up to things that aren't. And they've got a question about biases, desire to please investigators, which is an interesting one, because we do have free text, and I'm not sure there's a bias to please us given by some of the free text responses. It's interesting, people often write about their maths ability. So one of the last things in the survey is the numeracy test. And people often write, you know, oh, I'm so embarrassed, I couldn't answer the numeracy questions and things. So yes, there is some, I think there is some sort of, for a lot of people, there's a feeling that we are judging them on their responses. And that will undoubtedly, you know, there'll be social influences in how they answer some of the opinion type questions. And we're never going to get away from that, I don't think. On the other hand, as I say, it certainly doesn't apply to everybody, because their free text responses make it clear how much they really feel what they feel. So yeah, again, hands up, we can't get away from the fact that a lot of us will answer questions in the way that we feel we should, rather than perhaps our deep down true feelings.
Well, thank you so much. I am just really grateful to you and the whole team, to John, Claudia, Sarah, for participating in the discussion today. I think it's well worth noting explicitly that it is currently 10 p.m. in the UK. And so to have you join us from 9 to 10 p.m. in the evening is just a really incredible gift to this community of survey researchers. And so I'm so thankful for that. It's been a pleasure talking with you. We'll have to have you back again on a future episode of these calls to talk through some of these elements in more detail, the experimental element, the working across censorship and the like, but we're so grateful. Folks, in next week's session, we will have Carrie Funk from Pew Research in the US coming in to talk about the role of think tanks in survey-based research in COVID-19. The Pew Research Center has been doing some really interesting work and has a wide variety of different program focuses, from religion to journalism, that have all been dabbling a little bit into the COVID world. And so you won't want to miss that as we have the conversation next week. And let me just end by thanking you for being part of this community and joining us from New Zealand to North America to the UK. It's been great to have a global call here and connect. We'll be back same time, same place next week. And in the interim, you can always feel free to pass around information about the group, including the link to anyone as we expand this COVID research community. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.